Hello everyone, and welcome to a new series on my channel. As you can see from the title, this is probably going to be called Dark Souls Easy Mode Part 1, or maybe Part 0, depending on how I start my numbering. This series is mostly aimed at people who maybe aren't familiar with Dark Souls at all, or maybe who find it too difficult for their liking. And mostly I'm trying to take away some illusions about the difficulty of this game, trying to show you some things you can do to make life a lot easier for yourself in the game, tips and tricks and all sorts of cheesy and cheap ways to handle certain situations. The goal is basically to show people that this game is not as mind-numbingly impossibly difficult as it is sometimes made out to be, and instead is quite manageable and certainly not beyond the capabilities of anyone, really. I see a lot of people saying that, you know, using certain means to make the game easier is somehow cheating, like summoning help for bosses and such, and basically, I'm trying to also get rid of those preconceptions a little, at least. I mean, I know I don't have much of a reach with my channel, but the idea is, if you find the game too difficult, or if you've always been kind of interested but been scared off by people saying that it's the hardest game ever, fret not. Watch this, and I might convince you otherwise. Now, this first episode, I'll just be going over character creation. Sorry about that. So essentially, I'll try to get into what choices you have at the start of the game. Yeah, sure, let's go female, why not? Just kind of showing and telling you what you should do and what you should avoid. Now the class, unlike in other games where the class has a huge influence on gameplay, the class in Dark Souls is not completely irrelevant, but not majorly important. It affects the first maybe 2-3 hours of gameplay, depending on how fast you go. But eventually all the classes kind of blend together, and yeah, they're not really that relevant. That being said, I'll just go over your choices quickly and kind of say something about them. Now, the warrior, it's kind of decent if you're going to play a melee character. You start off with a fairly good sword. It is, I guess, pretty much focused on a balanced physical approach. The knight is a more defensive physical approach, so he will not be doing as much damage early game, but he has a stronger shield and more defense on his armor. So both of these choices are good if you're going to go for a melee character. The knight is a little more defensive, the warrior a little more offensive. It does not mean that the knight is easier per se. I would personally always prefer the warrior, but that's kind of individual choice. The Wanderer is a dex-focused character, as you can see, using a scimitar, which is not a bad weapon as such, but I'm not quite sure I would recommend it, really. For a first playthrough, I find balanced or strength weapons to be more advisable than dexterity weapons. But that's mostly because there's more enemies that will be difficult to kill with a dexterity weapon than there are enemies difficult to kill with a strength weapon. But again, we will get into those things eventually. Just in case you haven't noticed, by the way, this video will only cover character creation, so it's going to be a bit boring. But I think it's important, because the first impression let this game down quite a bit, because well, when you start up a game these days, you're used to the first hour or two being quite easy and kind of gently letting you get into the game, and, you know, starting off with very easy encounters, and this game kind of does that. but it has a somewhat different definition of what an easy encounter is. So surely the early game encounters in this game are a lot easier than late game stuff, but that's still quite a... well, that's not difficult to achieve, basically. Okay, the Thief, even more dexterity focused than the Wanderer, less defense, more dexterity. Generally not a bad class at all. The Thief starts out with a fairly strong weapon that it has very powerful critical hits, which basically means if you attack someone from behind or if you parry someone's attack and then riposte them, the Bandit Knife does a lot of damage then. But for just standard attacks, it's not terribly powerful. It has its uses, certainly, and if you know what you're doing, it can be a good choice. Again, for a beginner, not really advisable. One thing to note that it starts off with a Master Key by default, and that is a very valuable item. The Bandit is similar to the Thief. It's a heavy strength-focused melee character, so the Thief has a dedicated focus on dexterity. The Bandit is much more focused on strength, as you can see from the stats. He has very low dex, almost no intelligence, very little attunement, but his physical stats are actually alright. So if you're planning to play a dedicated strength build, that's good. But as I said, for a first playthrough, I'd say it's more useful to maybe go with a slightly more balanced approach of Warrior or Knight. The Hunter, I have no idea why you'd really want to play this. I mean, it's used in a speedrun setting, but apart from that, it gets a bow early on and a few arrows, but I would not advise to use the Hunter, basically. Bow and arrow are not as useful in this game as you might think. The Sorcerer. Now we're getting into the special classes, kind of, the magical ones. The Sorcerer starts out with a spell, but pretty much as soon as you're out of the tutorial, you're able to get that spell anyway. And you unlock the Magic Trainer quite quickly in the game. So unless you really want to play Magic from the start, it's not. I wouldn't advise using the Sorcerer because his physical attacks are very weak, and he has very little vitality and endurance, as you can see from his stats. So there's very few weapons he'll be able to use in the beginning, and he won't be able to take much punishment because he also has very light armor and a fairly bad shield. So basically, I'd say don't use the Sorcerer on your first playthrough. You can use magic later with any character. The only difference is that the Sorcerer gets it slightly sooner, but it's not a long wait to get sorcery, basically. And as you can see from the stat spread, 15 points in attunement and 15 in intelligence, that just doesn't leave many points for anything else. So he starts out with a fairly potent magic, but anything else is really left behind. So 8 vitality, that's the lowest it can get. 8 endurance is also the lowest it can get. It just makes this character fairly weak. Now, the advantage of it is if you're planning to eventually play some sort of late game hybrid physical and caster, then this character has the least stat points wasted, because vitality, depending on your playstyle, is not relevant. For a beginner it is, definitely, but for an advanced player this can actually be a good choice, because you don't waste any points on vitality, which an advanced player who focuses on dodging doesn't really need. You have no resistance, which an advanced player, well, which any player doesn't need. And you have no faith, which if you're planning to play a mage build, you don't need faith. So you have no points wasted, basically. And it's good in that regard, but for a beginner I would not advise it. The Pyromancer is actually quite an interesting class, which for a beginner might actually be worthwhile. Starts at the lowest level of all the classes, so he has the least stat points to begin with, but he starts out with Pyromancy. The shield he gets at the beginning is useless, as you can see, it's kind of broken. The hand axe that he gets is actually quite good. It's it's a decent, solid starting weapon. And Pyromancy, of all the different types of magic that there are in the game, takes the longest to get another way. So you basically have one starting spell and the means to cast it. In any other class would probably take the longest to get that magic, but still not that long. So the Pyromancer is a good choice, just because it has a decent ranged option right from the get-go. So if you like that sort of thing, this can actually be quite valid to use as a beginning player. I myself won't use it, but it's not a bad choice. So if you really want to focus on magic, this is a good way to go about it. Now, for some reason, a lot of people seem to think that your first playthrough has to be melee based, and I think the reason that advice comes about is because it's fairly straightforward. You find a new weapon, you might like it, you upgrade it, and you're kind of set. Magic is more complex in the sense that it's not as easily, or it's not as obvious where you get new spells, for example. So it's not just in your main hub there's a guy who sells you spells. You have to find the guy first, and he might sell you spells, but eventually he might leave, and then you can no longer buy spells, and then suddenly you find him in a very different corner of the world, and you need to free him from something or other. So, yeah, I'll get into where to find certain spells, but for a blind playthrough, as your first playthrough, I guess it makes sense to play melee, because there are less must-have items for a melee player, because, you know, if you like a weapon, then you can use that weapon. And really, there's very few weapons that aren't valid late game. You will have a choice of weapons, and you don't really have to go out of your way, do complicated stuff, and look in every corner to find just some weapon. To find a very specific one, you might have to, but yeah, you'll probably have something that you like, even if you don't go out of your way to search everywhere for good stuff. But yeah, there's no reason to really avoid magic. People seem to think that you have to make this game hard on yourself to play it properly, and that's just bullshit. Play the game you like, and if you don't find the difficulty to your liking, then the game offers you plenty of methods to make the game easier for yourself. And it's not cheap or somehow cheating to take advantage of these options. Okay, the Cleric is your initial, I guess not really Paladin, but using a healing miracle. So you start off with a healing miracle. It's not as useful as it sounds, because it simply takes a while to cast. It can be useful outside of combat, when you have the time to cast it, but generally speaking, I wouldn't start out as a Cleric on the first character. The heal miracle, it takes too long to cast to be useful in combat, and you don't really have a very good stat spread aside from the fact that you just get that miracle, so I don't know, I would not advise it. Just, you get miracles quite early on anyway, and yeah, it's just, it seems a bit silly to go for a Cleric just for that starting advantage, which you can get without being a Cleric within, I don't know, an hour of the game anyway. So I would not advise the Cleric. My options for a beginner would either be Pyromancer, if you're planning to do some magic, because he starts at the lowest level, he's got the most room to basically go whichever direction you want with the character, because he simply has the least stat points already spent on stuff. So, I mean, you can take a Pyromancer and you're not locked into being a magic user. You can just say, okay, fine, I tried Pyromancy, I don't like it, I'll go find a big hammer and smash people into the ground with it, and that is fine. You can do that. Sorcerer, for your second playthrough, you might use that. For your first one, I wouldn't advise it. Bandit or a thief, if you're, again, probably on a second playthrough when you're more used to how the combat flows and such, because they both sacrifice versatility in combat for a very single purpose approach to to combat. Wanderer, I guess, can be decent enough if you like dexterity weapons and you know you want to use those. Again, for a first playthrough, maybe not advisable, but up to you. I'd say it's a choice that can be done. Knight and Warrior, probably my suggested classes, so I'm going to go Warrior because it has more offensive capabilities in the beginning. But Knight is solid. I mean, all the classes are kind of solid, except for Deprived, which is kind of a gimmick class. It starts out with basically all stats set to 11, which is terrible, because you have a lot of wasted stat points into stuff that you're never going to use that way. And you're just making early game difficult for yourself. So, again, it's a gimmick, it's a joke, put in for people to be able to say, oh, I did it on Deprived, which really doesn't mean anything. Unless you want to make the beginning harder on yourself intentionally, don't use the Deprived. So yeah, I'd go Pyromancer, Warrior, or Knight for your first playthrough. Maybe Wanderer if you will like the decks. I'm going to go Warrior. Starting gift, again, I'll go over these. I know the video is quite long and quite boring, but yeah. It's probably why it's called Part 0 and it says optional or something. Take it or leave it, I guess. Starting gifts. Now, none is kind of... If you like the role-playing aspect of it, you can go for no starting gift, but it's a bit pointless. Goddess's Blessing gives you, I think, 3 of these items. They are single-use healing items, which fully heal you and cure any status ailments. They are very rare in the game. There's a very limited number you can actually get normally within the game. I still wouldn't advise using it as your starting gift. Really, there's one starting gift to rule them all. But, yeah, Goddess's Blessing. I would not use that, basically. You have enough healing items anyway, and because they are so limited, they might help you out in a clutch situation, but it just gets that problem that they are so rare and special that you might very well end up never using them because you want to save them for a better occasion, which is what always happens to me when I get some super rare special item, that I end up, well, never using it, instead of using it for a good situation. Black Firebombs, the only real advantage these give you is that they allow you to beat an early game encounter before you're quote-unquote meant to. It's not cheating or anything like that. It's definitely something that the developers intended to be possible, and this makes these firebombs make it a lot easier. They're kind of handy early game for just being damage on a stick, so if you like that sort of thing, that's decent. Twin Humanities, you find enough Humanities in the game. I really wouldn't advise using those. I don't think there's really any reason to use them. Binoculars, you find these right after the tutorial is over. No point taking these, do not take them, they are pointless. It takes a single suicide run about, let's say, 20 minutes into the game and you have binoculars. The pendant has no effect at all. You can trade it for another fairly random, well, fairly useless item at a certain NPC. Aside from that, it has no effect on gameplay. So, this was put in as a bit of a troll by the developers, who they basically wanted people to think that there's some hidden use to the pendant, but there really isn't. Master Key is the starting gift that on the second or third playthrough, anything beyond that, make sure you get the Master Key. It is by far the best starting gift. Nothing else compares to it even. So unless you start as the Thief, which always gets the Master Key, I would strongly suggest using the Master Key. It allows you to perform some early game skips, which give you quite an edge. I will show you where to go with it and what you can do with it and such. So yeah, I'm going with the Master Key. Tiny Being's Ring, tempting for a lot of new players because it says HP recovers slowly while equipped. That's just a lie. It's, for some reason, they never fixed the description of it. It doesn't recover HP. It gives you, I think, 5% maximum HP. So it doesn't heal you, it just gives you more HP. And those 5% rarely make the difference, really. And again, it doesn't recover HP. The description given here is just false, and they never fixed it. So that makes this a useless starting gift. The Old Witch's Ring, the only purpose of that is that it allows you to talk to a certain NPC. For a lore-centric playthrough, it might be interesting, but in general, I would advise against it. First playthrough, especially if you're trying to follow the path I'm taking through the game, go with a Master Key. It's by far the best item. It should be noted that all these items can be obtained in-game anyway. Not always very easily, but all of them are available, so yeah. Physique has no effect on gameplay. Similarly, face has no effect on gameplay. Was that the face I wanted? I had one that I quite liked on another character. Oh well, let's go with that one. Color. Okay, why not? So, yeah, those would be the starting options that I choose. As I said, the gift Master Key really is by far the superior choice. Unless you start with a Thief, in which case you already have the Master Key and you can choose any of the other ones that are to your liking. Class. I know I spent a long time talking about it and prefacing it by saying it's not really that relevant. It does affect the early game a fair bit, so it affects when you can equip certain weapons and such, and I feel that the warrior is, for a beginner, it's the best choice, but some others are valid. I spoke about that quite a long time, so that's the end of this particular episode. I will, in this playthrough, be skipping the cutscenes and all that. It's not focused on lore, it's focused on, well, how to get through the game the easiest, I guess. So, yeah, that's character creation for you. Next time we'll go through the tutorial. I hope this was at least somewhat informative, even though it was incredibly boring. See you next time.